Let me start by saying I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because for a long time I was ashamed of where I came from, and I've spent the last few years realizing that shame was never mine to carry. So here it is, the whole thing, from the beginning. I grew up in a small Rust Belt city in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place that used to have a purpose steel mills, manufacturing plants, that whole world, and then one day didn't. By the time I was born in 1987, most of those jobs were already ghosts. The men in my neighborhood walked around with a specific kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of people who had been promised something and watched the promise dissolve. My mother, Denise, raised me and my two younger sisters on her own after my father left when I was 5. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I processed that particular wound a long time ago, but back then it was a defining fact of our lives. One parent, 3 kids, and an income that came from a combination of part-time cashier work and whatever assistance programs we could access. We lived in a rental house on Caldwell Street. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom where the hot water worked maybe 60% of the time, and a kitchen with a linoleum floor that had peeled up in one corner so badly that my sister Bria once cut her foot on it. The landlord, a man named Gerald Potts, owned 7 or 8 properties in our neighborhood. He lived in a different part of town, the part with sidewalks that didn't crock and gutters that actually drained properly. He drove a tan Buick and wore a gold watch that I noticed every single time he came to collect rent in person, which he did because he didn't trust mail and didn't yet have a reason to trust bank transfers. Gerald Potts was not the worst person I've ever met. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about a monster. He was something more ordinary than a monster. He was a man who saw poor people as a revenue stream and nothing else. He wasn't cruel in a theatrical way, he was indifferent in an absolute way, which in practice feels almost identical. When I was 9 years old, we fell behind on rent, 3 months behind. My mother had missed work for 2 weeks because of a back injury. She slipped in the parking lot of the grocery store where she worked, and the company's workers' compensation process was slow and complicated and seemed deliberately designed to outlast the patience of someone without the resources to fight it. We had burned through our small savings. We had borrowed from my grandmother until my grandmother had nothing left to lend. And then, one morning in October, a sheriff's deputy came to the door and handed my mother a piece of paper. I remember that morning with the kind of precision that trauma tends to produce. I remember the deputy's dark jacket and the way he looked at the ground while he spoke. I remember my mother's face going very still. I remember my sister Keisha, who was 6, asking what was happening, and my mother saying, "Nothing, baby, go watch TV," in a voice so controlled it almost didn't sound like her voice at all. We had 30 days. We spent those 30 days in a specific kind of suspended dread. My mother was on the phone constantly, calling churches, calling the city, calling anyone who might have a resource or a lead. She found us a place eventually, a 2-room apartment above a laundromat about a mile away, smaller than where we'd been and more expensive per square foot because that's how poverty works. The worse your situation, the more everything costs. We packed our belongings into trash bags in the back of my uncle's pickup truck and we left Caldwell Street in November, right before Thanksgiving. I cried in the truck. I turned toward the window so nobody would see it, but my uncle saw it anyway and put his hand briefly on my shoulder without saying anything. That small gesture has stayed with me for 35 years. The apartment above the laundromat was where I finished growing up. It was loud and hot in summer and drafty in winter, and I did my homework on the floor because we didn't have a table for the first 8 months. I got a paper route at 11, I started mowing lawns at 12. Not because anyone told me to, I just had this engine in me that wouldn't stop running, this deep and wordless understanding that the only variable I had real control over was my own effort. I was not a straight A student. I want to dispel that particular version of the bootstraps narrative right now. I was a B- student who worked hard in the subjects I cared about and scraped by in the ones I didn't. I liked math and I liked building things. In 8th grade, my shop teacher, Mr. Daniels, pulled me aside after class one day and told me I had a natural instinct for how structures worked, how load was distributed, how materials behaved. He said it like it mattered. It was the first time an adult outside my family told me I was good at something specific, and I held on to it. I applied to a 2-year technical college after high school because a 4-year university felt like a fantasy, and also because I genuinely wanted to work with my hands. I studied construction management. I took out loans, I worked nights at a warehouse to pay for rent and food. I graduated in 2008, which, if you know your history, you know was a spectacularly bad time to enter any field related to construction or real estate. What happened next was not a straight line. There is no version of this story where everything clicked into place after graduation. I spent 2 years doing whatever work I could find: drywall, roofing, demo work, anything. I ate a lot of cheap food. There were 2 months in 2009 where I genuinely didn't know how I was going to cover my rent, and the memory of my mother's face on that morning in October 1996 kept me up at night. I was terrified of becoming that again, terrified of the paper being handed to me at the door. The turn came slowly, the way real turns do. A contractor named Phil Osai took a chance on me in 2010 and hired me as a site supervisor for a small commercial renovation project. I was 23 and the oldest guy on the crew was 51, and I was absolutely certain they all thought I was a joke. I responded to that by being the first one there in the morning and the last one to leave in the first week, and by learning the name of every single person on that crew. Phil told me later that the thing that impressed him most wasn't my technical knowledge, it was that I knew how to make people feel like their work mattered. I stayed with Phil for 4 years. I learned everything I could. I saved aggressively. In 2014, I got my general contractor's license. In 2016, I started my own company. Just me, a truck, and 2 guys I trusted. We did residential renovations, kitchen remodels, bathroom updates, basement finishing, the kind of work that is unglamorous but steady. The company grew. By 2019, we had 12 employees and a real office and a reputation in 3 counties. I was not rich by any common definition of the word, but I was stable in a way that felt almost foreign to me. I owned my truck outright, I had savings, I had health insurance. I understood intellectually that these were ordinary things, but they felt extraordinary every single day. And then the pandemic hit, and everything got strange, and I won't take you through all of that, except to say that construction was deemed essential in Pennsylvania, and we stayed busy, busier than ever actually, because everyone suddenly needed their houses to work better. By late 2021, my company had doubled in size again, and I had more money in the bank than I'd ever imagined having. I don't know exactly when the thought first surfaced. It had probably always been there in some background layer of my mind, but at some point in 2022, I started wondering about Caldwell Street. I pulled it up on Google Maps one afternoon and just sat there looking at the satellite image. The house was still there. The neighborhood looked different, quieter, emptier, a few vacant lots where other houses used to be, but 412 Caldwell Street was still standing. I did a property record search on a whim, the kind of thing I do routinely for work, just plugging an address into the county assessor's website. The house still belonged to Gerald Potts. He was in his late 70s now. The property value had dropped significantly since the 90s. The neighborhood hadn't recovered the way some Rust Belt areas had. It was listed for tax assessment at a number that I turned over in my head for a long time. I don't want to make this sound like some dramatic revenge scheme, because it wasn't. What I felt was not quite revenge. It was something harder to name, maybe the desire to rewrite a small piece of the story, to put myself on the other side of a transaction that had defined something fundamental about my childhood. I reached out to a real estate agent I knew and told her I was interested in a property on Caldwell Street. I didn't explain why. She did some digging and found that Potts had been trying to offload several of his properties for the last couple of years. The management had become too much for him, and the rental income wasn't what it had been. The Caldwell Street house had been vacant for 14 months. I made an offer through my agent without revealing who I was. The offer was fair. Not lowball, not inflated, just fair. It was accepted within a week. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. In Pennsylvania, closings don't always require both parties to be present in person. A lot of it happens through title companies and signed documents. But I'd specifically requested an in-person closing, and Gerald Potts, perhaps out of old habit or curiosity, showed up. He was old. That was the first thing I registered. He walked with a cane, and his gold watch was still there on his wrist, but his hands had the slightly translucent look of very old skin. He came in with a younger man I didn't recognize, maybe his son or a nephew, and they sat across the table from me and my agent. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. I was a 9-year-old child the last time he saw me. I am now a broad-shouldered man in my mid-30s with a gray streak in my beard and a good coat. Why would he recognize me? We got through the formalities. The title company representative went through the documents, signatures were exchanged, and then at the end, when everything was done and the house was legally mine, I slid a folded piece of paper across the table to Gerald Potts. He opened it and looked at it. It was a photograph, an old one my mother had kept, printed on the thin paper of a Walmart photo lab. It was me and my sisters standing in front of 412 Caldwell Street, probably taken in the summer of 1995, a year or so before the eviction. My mother was at the edge of the frame. We were squinting into the sun. I told him my name. I told him my mother's name. I told him the year. He stared at the photograph for a long time. The title company representative looked slightly confused. My agent looked at her phone. I'm not going to tell you Gerald Potts broke down and wept and asked for forgiveness because that isn't what happened. What happened was more ordinary and, I think, more true. He looked up from the photograph and then he looked at the signed documents on the table in front of him and he said very quietly, "Denise's boy." And I said, "Yes." And then there was a silence that held more than words could have anyway. He left with his paperwork and his cane and the younger man who I assumed was family. I stayed at the table for another few minutes after everyone else had cleared out, just sitting there in the quiet of the title company's conference room with its generic landscape prints and its water pitcher. I called my mother on the drive home. She answered on the second ring, the way she always does. I told her I had something to show her, and she said okay, and that same voice she's always used, the one that sounds like she's bracing slightly for news, a habit she built over a lifetime of news being complicated. I drove to her house. She lives in a modest place in a different part of the same city, a house she owns, something she managed to accomplish in her 60s, and I handed her the keys. She turned them over in her hand. She asked me what they were for. I told her. She sat down on her couch and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said my name, my full name, first and middle, the way she only does in very serious moments. And then she cried. And I sat next to her and let her cry. And I didn't say anything either because some moments are larger than words, and you just have to let them take up the space they need. I've been renovating the house on Caldwell Street for the last 4 months. My crew is doing the work and they know it's personal to me. I told them why. The guy who handles our plumbing, Terrence, told me it was the best job he'd ever been hired for. We're replacing the floors, updating the kitchen, fixing the bathroom, putting in proper insulation. I'm going to rent it to a family at below market rate. I've been in contact with a local nonprofit that works with families in housing instability, and they'll help me identify the right tenants. I don't know if what I did constitutes justice or closure or something else entirely. I'm not sure those categories matter as much as I once thought they did. What I know is that the house on Caldwell Street is going to be warm next winter. Someone is going to live there who needs a stable place, and they're going to have it. And somewhere in all of that, a 9-year-old kid standing in front of that house and squinting into the sun finally gets to feel like the story came out okay. It came out more than okay. My mother hung the photograph on her wall. The original one, the one I slid across the table at the closing. She had it framed. Every time I visit her and I walk past it in the hallway, I think about that morning in October and the deputy's dark jacket and my sister asking what was happening, and my mother's voice going smooth and controlled to protect us from the shape of the thing. She protected us so well, for so long. It's good to finally have something to give back.